Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to welcome you to another virtual Author Talks presentation here with Atlanta History Center. Tonight, we are partnering with American Heritage Chocolate, and we are just thrilled to be welcoming author Adrian Miller virtually to Atlanta tonight. So this is our second program with Adrian, and I think y'all are in for a real treat this evening. Tonight, our program will be moderated by a real live chocolate historian. And there he is. Hi, Dave. Yes, that's a real job, and it's one of the coolest jobs I've ever heard of. So Dave Borgasani has enjoyed a career of 34 years with Mars Wrigley, serving in both internal sales support and field sales roles. Dave has worked very closely with the American Heritage Chocolate team for over 5 years, researching and telling the story of chocolate and the role it has played in the history of societies for over 3,500 years. Dave has spoken to groups at historic sites such as Colonial Williamsburg, Monticello, the Smithsonian National American History Museum, the National Archives, the Betsy Ross House, and now Atlanta History Center. He tells a story of how chocolate has been bringing people together for thousands of years while highlighting its inclusive past. Everyone has a chocolate story, and it is the world's most favorite flavor. Dave, welcome to Atlanta History Center. We're thrilled to have you.
Claire, and thank you for acknowledging that everybody loves chocolate. It is fantastic. And I am really happy to be here tonight at the Atlanta History Center. And of course, really pleased to be here with Adrian Miller to celebrate the launch of his newest book, Black Smoke, African Americans and the United States of Barbecue. Hey, if you haven't already purchased the book, Atlanta History Center is partnering with 44th and 3rd booksellers. They can take your book orders online, and I believe we're going to put up their web address. So you can go ahead and order your copy. And trust me, when I tell you, I have read 3 of Adrian's book, all 3 of them. This one is fun. I really encourage you to get it. And one of the things that I love about what Adrian does is he includes recipes. And if you ever want some really great barbecue recipes, I encourage you to get a hold of this. Adrian, otherwise known as a soul food scholar, is a food writer, a James Beard Award winner, attorney, certified barbecue judge who lives in Denver, Colorado. He has served as a special assistant to President Clinton, a senior policy analyst for Colorado Governor Bill Ritter Jr., and a Southern Foodways Alliance board member. Hey, Adrian.
What's going on, Dave? Good to be with you here tonight.
Always good to talk to you, my friend. And we know that food brings us together, Adrian. And since I work for Mars Wrigley, I know chocolate sure does that. Listen, American Heritage Chocolate and Mars are committed to educating the world about the inclusive history of chocolate, the stories of triumph and trial, the American journey. And we love the stories that Adrian tells. And trust me when I tell you, we are so honored to be here sharing details from his newest book.
I love it, man. Let's do this thing.
Right. So, hey, tonight's program for everybody out there is really interesting and mouth-watering. So be sure to use the Q&A feature in order to ask questions. We're going to do our very best to take them during and at the conclusion of our event, but if not, we'll try to get them certainly before we're done this evening. So Adrian, if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's get started. Why don't you tell us more about your book?
All right. Well, thank you to Atlanta History Center once again for this opportunity. And so I'm going to just do a PowerPoint presentation that gives you a feel for the themes of my book. And we're just going to kind of go through the chapters. So we'll just go ahead and get that started now. So this is me in one of my favorite barbecue joints in Denver, Colorado. You can tell I'm very, very pleased with this meal. Let's go to the next slide. All through tonight, you are strongly encouraged to do social media. So I make it easy for people. So I'm at Soul Food Scholar. So definitely hit me up and give me some positive vibes, some love. Unless you're going to say something critical, then there's no reason to do social media. So let's just quickly go through my writing journey. For those who haven't don't know about my books, my first book was on the history of soul food. I won a James Beard Award for that book. And it was really in that book that I started exploring barbecue culture, because I really thought I was going to have a chapter just on barbecue in that book. But as I dug more deeply into the subject, I thought, no, it needs its own treatment. And then I wrote a book on the history of Black chefs in the White House called The President's Kitchen Cabinet. And again, that was really an effort to kind of tell the story of a collective biography of some cooks that have not been known before. But tonight we're talking about black smoke.
And Adrian, we might not be having audio here, but trust me, folks at home, the audio that goes with that announces Adrian's presence.
Yeah, with some fanfare. I wanted to give you a kind of a drive-in movie feature feel. So one question is, what really sparked me to write this book? And so August of 2004, I'm sitting at home, I'm watching the Food Network, and I see a commercial for something called Paula Deen's Southern Barbecue. And I'm thinking, okay, yeah, I should watch that because I knew at some point I was going to write a book on barbecue, and that I thought the show would just kind of highlight the leading figures. I could get a sense of current trends, all of that kind of stuff when it comes to barbecue. So an hour later, as the credits are rolling, my mouth is agape because there were no African Americans featured on that show. And so the first thing I thought, well, how does that even happen in 2004? And the second thing I thought is like, well, maybe I got it twisted. I should have paid closer attention to the promotional, the commercials. Maybe it was Paula Deen's Scandinavian barbecue sponsored by Alabama White Sauce. So I started looking at other barbecue programming, and it was pretty much the same vibe. Either African Americans were completely left out of the story or pushed to the margins as if they were just minimal contributors to this beloved food tradition. And that didn't square with my experience growing up, even in Denver, Colorado, eating barbecue and what I knew about American barbecue. So Black Smoke is really a celebration of African American barbecue culture, and also really a restoration of African Americans to the barbecue narrative. So let's take a look at old school barbecue. So this is a cover from Harper's Weekly in November 9th, 1895. And this is look at something called the Atlanta Exposition. So this was a big deal, written about extensively and syndicated across the country. And so we're going to zoom in on the scene here. So there was a Georgia barbecue exhibit at the exposition. It was wildly popular. And when we zoom in on the scene here, we're going to notice something interesting. So we've got some African-American men who are cooking barbecue in the middle here. And this was old school barbecue. It was digging a trench, a couple feet wide, maybe a foot and a half deep, could be a little bit deeper, filling it with hardwood burning coals, getting whole animals. And the animals could be pork, it could be pigs, cows, sheep, goats, whatever. A lot of things showed up on the barbecue, over the barbecue pit in the South. So we shouldn't think it was just pork. And then those animals would be butterflied, and then poles would be stuck through the sides of them. And then you would have to flip those animals frequently to keep them from burning and to make sure they were evenly cooked. And then they would be doused with sauce. So African Americans were the ones who primarily did this work. Old school barbecue was very labor intensive. And the racial dynamics of the time in the South, if you're going to have somebody do a lot of hard work, and if you're not going to compensate them or pay them very little, African Americans are the ones that do it. Now, if we go to the right of these gentlemen, you see there's a guy there with a shovel. He's got some hardwood burning coals that he's going to add to the pit here. So his job was to maintain a separate fire and then replenish the coals whenever the coals were dying in the trench. And the idea was just to make sure there was an even temperature for cooking the meat. Behind him, you see a group of white spectators just beholding the whole scene because this was a spectacle. And then we go over to the above the gentleman. You see another guy in a top hat, white guy in a top hat who's kind of pointing stuff out. So he would be kind of the grand barbecue guy in terms of who the media would fixate upon. And so we don't know how much he knew about barbecuing and how much he did the work, but he was just kind of directing things. And so usually it was this kind of white guy who got the credit for the barbecue, even though African Americans were doing a lot of the work. And then we're going to go to the top of the picture. On the right-hand side, you can see a couple of guys sitting on a bale of hay. One guy has a harmonica, and so they would be the after barbecue entertainment. And then at the very top, we see a guy with two big kettles. He's making something called Brunswick stew. Y'all in Georgia are very familiar with this. This is a chicken and vegetable stew that is a very popular side dish with barbecue in Georgia. So that's old school barbecue. That's how barbecue was for a couple of centuries. Now, let's fast forward to the present. This is a feature in Bon Appetit magazine in July 2003 saying who's who in American barbecue. So, you know, a nice kind of backyard scene, people playing games. So let's zoom in on that for a second. Now, if you remember the Where's Waldo illustrations in the 1990s, the virtue of that is that Waldo was actually somewhere in the picture. So if I asked you where are the African Americans, I'm just going to spare you the time. You're not going to find any. The closest we get to some kind of ethnicity is the Asian American guy in the middle with the beach ball. And then everyone else is a white guy except for the woman. If you focus on the guy in the beach ball and go kind of two people over, you see there's a woman there at the grill. But everybody else is a white guy featured prominently in barbecue. So the question is, how do we go from that old school representation, very African American centric, to a scene where you don't have any African Americans at all? All right, so that leads me to Black Smoke. And so, yeah, the question is, how do we go from that to this? And that's what prompted me to write Black Smoke. And the idea here, again, is to celebrate African American barbecue culture and restore African Americans to the barbecue narrative. So, one of the things that I wanted to focus upon was just the early history of barbecue, which is very hazy. And so I started looking at Native American traditions. And my takeaway is that Native American smoking traditions are the foundation for what would eventually become Southern barbecue. And so I took a look at a lot of early European travel diaries and observations of the Native Americans they encountered in the American South and what they noticed about their cooking techniques. And the reason I did this is because the earliest depiction we have of barbecue in the Americas is Columbus and crew arriving in the Caribbean. They see Native Americans cooking on a raised platform, which we'll talk about in a second, cooking fish, iguanas, and vegetables. And so cooking over a slow fire on a raised platform is very different than that trench method that I showed you earlier. So I'm wondering, you know, what's a great way to connect the dots? And so I wanted to figure out what Native Americans were doing right around the time that Europeans start showing up. So one technique is what I call the pierce sticks. And so sometimes animal would be killed and strips of meat would be put on a framework of pierce sticks and then angled towards the fire and angled away in order to cook it. Or sometimes a long stick was planted in the ground, a morsel of meat was put on the very tip of the stick, and the weight of that morsel bent it towards the fire. And you could go do some other stuff and come back later and eat that tasty meat. Another method was the spit method. Now, these were all made out of sticks, right? Because Native Americans did not have metallurgy like the Europeans did. But the spit method would have been very familiar to the Europeans because that was a similar way that they cooked. Next slide. And then there was the raised platform. So even though there's a depiction of it in the Caribbean, Europeans said that they saw something similar in the American South. So there was probably some cultural contact where that cooking method spans throughout the Americas. Another cooking technique is the earth oven. And the earth oven is something we see in cultures around the world. It's a deeper vertical hole, usually a combination of wood and stones are put at the bottom, set on fire because the stones would retain heat. And then there's layers of moist vegetation and meat, and they layer this until you get to the surface level, and then it's either covered with something or buried. Now, if you started this early in the day, you could have a meal by the end of the day, but there are times when people would start cooking at the very end of the day, and then the next morning you'd have a breakfast of champions. So those are some examples of traditions that go back to Native Americans. And then we have the final one, which I call the shallow pit. So we talked about the deeper pit earlier, but there were Europeans who saw kind of shallower depressions in the ground where, again, a combination of wood and stones were used and then set on fire. And meat was either put directly on top of the wood and the stones, or there were sticks laid across the depression in order to create a lattice pattern, and then the meat was laid upon that. And my argument is that Native American techniques with this method, the shallow pit, were then viewed by the Europeans, modified, and then enslaved Africans came into the mix, and that puts us on the road to what we call Southern barbecue. All right. Go to the next slide. So because barbecue was so labor intensive, essentially African Americans, particularly enslaved African Americans, get connected to barbecue. So by the time you get to the 1830s, you've got newspaper articles talking about authentic barbecue. And essentially, they are saying that African Americans are the essential cooks for barbecue. So this is an article from a newspaper account in Maine in 1839. And in that article, the author taps a friend from Virginia and asks the friend from Virginia to describe what an authentic, a legit Southern barbecue is. And so a few lines down in this article, the Virginian reported back, on the previous day from the barbecue, some favorite Negro man of reputation and skill and experience in the business is set up with his assistants who proceed to make a kiln or pits of stones. And that's the barbecue pit method that we were talking about. So essentially, blackness and barbecue get wedded in the 19th century. And again, it's because this is very labor intensive work. And this relationship endures for another good century, even after this point, after being underway for a previous century. All right, so after I talk, and so the point here is that by the time you get to the mid 19th century, and especially after emancipation, African Americans are established as barbecue's go-to cooks and barbecue's most effective ambassador. So the word on the street, out in the country, wherever you went, was that if you wanted really good Southern barbecue, an African American making it is probably the way to go. So that was the conventional wisdom that had coalesced. So after talking about this early kind of barbecue history, my book turns to looking to different aspects of African American barbecue culture. And I decided to start with the church because the church is one of the earliest independent institutions of African Americans. And church politicians and preachers really figured out that barbecue was a good way to build a crowd. And so I talked about the emerging church culture and how barbecue was often used in those early church gatherings, not only for small gatherings, but also the massive multi-day revivals and camp meetings that took place. And I got to tell you, Dave, this chapter was really distracting from my own spiritual journey because, I just tell you, when I look in the Bible and I see the words burnt offerings, I start thinking about barbecue. I think about the burning bush story. I wonder if it smelled to Moses like hickory or oak, maybe mesquite. The prophecy about the valley of dry bones where they spare ribs, things like that. I know I need spiritual counseling.
Well, I can't give you the spiritual counseling tonight, but I don't know what kind of tree that was. That was the actual burning bush. Bible doesn't say so. It could have been a cedar, a cypress. It could have been something regional. We'll just never know. But sure, Moses was well aware that something was going on magical, something spiritual. Burnt offerings, I got to tell you though, Adrian, that's very Old Testament of you. So proves that you're connected with that as well too. Hey, everybody who is watching, if you haven't put your questions in the Q&A, we'd certainly like you to do that. We certainly want to find out what's on your mind and be able to ask Adrian, ask the author, find out the questions that you have, and hopefully you're thinking of some right now. And if you're getting excited about barbecue the way I know I get excited, we have some great news for you. The Atlanta History Center will be giving away 3 books, so please stay on as we will be randomly selecting winners at the end of the night. So I noticed, Adrian, that you actually highlight different barbecue chefs in each chapter of your book. And can you tell us a little bit about, I hope, the gentleman that's going to appear on the screen?
The one before him. So just quickly, in the church one, so the guy on the right is a guy named Daddy Bruce Randolph Sr., well-known barbecue guy in Denver. And let me just say that the ad on the left is from a Montana church, Black church in the 1920s. But Daddy Bruce, as he was called, made good barbecue, and he lived until he was 94 and started a barbecue business in his 60s. But he was a humanitarian. So every Thanksgiving, he would feed up to 10,000 people, give them a free meal. So although he was not an ordained clergy, he was a man who lived out his faith. So I wanted to show him in the church barbecue. And then the next chapter, I talk about barbecue freelancers. So this is one of my favorite guys, a guy named Columbus B. Hill, shows up in Colorado in the late 1870s, and in short order is doing barbecue for thousands of people. When our state capitol had its cornerstone laying ceremony on July 4th, 1890, he did a barbecue for 25,000 people right in front of the Capitol. And then towards the end of that decade, he did a barbecue for something called the Stock Show. It's a huge tradition here in Denver. It's a big deal. And in 1898, he was supposed to do a barbecue for 5,000 people. It was a VIP barbecue, but 30,000 people showed up. And so it turned into a food riot. It did stain his reputation, much like barbecue sauce stains other things, but he was able to rehabilitate himself, and he was one of the great barbecue men of the West. And then I turned to the entrepreneurs, because after these freelancers are roaming around the country giving people a sense of great barbecue, there were some people that decided to kickstart businesses in a community. And one great example is Henry Perry, who was acknowledged as the father of Kansas City barbecue. And if you look at his newspaper ad here, first of all, he's calling himself the barbecue king. And barbecue was full of self-promotion, right? A lot of people called themselves the barbecue king, and even multiple people in the same city. But I love this guy because if you look at this ad, not only in addition to the traditional things we think about with barbecue, like beef and pork, he's got groundhog, raccoon, opossum, everything went on that grill, which is true to the Kansas City tradition, which is an eclectic mix. And then on the right, we have Ernestine Vanderwall, who grew up in Nicodemus, Kansas. And if you don't know about Nicodemus, Kansas, it was one of the earliest communities started by formerly enslaved people. And this was founded in the mid 1870s, and it still exists to this day. Ernestine Vanderwall grew up there, left for Pasadena, California, and ran a barbecue restaurant there. And evidently Walt Disney loved her food. But later in life, she returned to Nicodemus and ran a barbecue restaurant there that her niece, Angela Bates, runs to this day. And it's a great story of a great community. Next slide. But barbecue entrepreneurs were not always welcome. So this is a headline from the Chicago Defender, one of the leading Black newspapers of the time. And they were basically telling people to stop eating barbecue sold by these street vendors. And they called them germ dealers, because a lot of these dudes were getting meat, and they were in, often suspect meat, and they were cooking on bed springs, improvised, devices and things like that. So they just felt it was too low class and a danger to people's health. So they weren't always welcome. Next slide. And then I spent a whole chapter on barbecue sauce, because there's an emerging conventional wisdom that barbecue should be unsauced. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say a lot of African Americans are probably thinking when they hear that, says who? I mean, I've been at places where I've been served a plate of barbecue with an ocean of sauce and little islands of meat poking through. But in this, on the left-hand side, you've got an editorial cartoon that was penned when Arthur Bryant of Kansas City died, legendary barbecue guy in Kansas City. And when he died, he's here at the pearly gates with St. Peter, and St. Peter asks, "Did you bring the sauce?" And then on the other side, we have an ad from an Atlanta newspaper in the early 1900s. And I love this ad because it's an ad for barbecue sauce. And much like the Times today, and even until recent history, African Americans were used to basically certify that a product was legit and it's something you should buy. And so given the connection with Blackness and barbecue, it makes a lot of sense to put an African American here. But instead of caricaturing this person, he's treated with respect. He's shown as an expert. He's an elderly African American man, but he's clearly a guy who knows what he's doing. And I got to tell you, I'm a little surprised that there wasn't a corollary to Aunt Jemima or Uncle Ben or Faustus of the cream of wheat genre in barbecue, because there was just such a strong connection. Next slide. And then I do a profile of this guy, R.G. B. Collins, a great barbecue guy in Chicago. And what I love about him is he was visionary. Rather than rest on his laurels with his success in the Black community, he was looking for the mainstream market. And so he marketed something called mumbo sauce, and it's definitely a Chicago thing, although there are variations that show up in other places like Washington, D.C.
Adrian, I was confused. Originally, when I saw the picture, I thought maybe that was you, looking very dapper like that. It's a very dapper looking picture there. But I didn't mistake you for that?
Nah, man, he's much smoother than I am, but thank you.
Okay.
I take that as a compliment.
Yeah. Adrian, I'm a sauce guy. I mean, I don't know how you enjoy barbecue without at least a little bit of sauce. You don't want to drown it, right? You just want to bring out the flavor of the meat. And, in your book, you referenced this mumbo sauce that you just talked about here too. Now, I found it very challenging to find it. And maybe that's because I live in the Northeast, and maybe geography has something to do with it. However, I did find some sauce called mambo sauce. Adrian, can you maybe comment a little bit on the differences between these two and any other kind of sauce that you want to talk about?
Well, it gets kind of confusing, Dave, because the earliest iterations of Colin's sauce was called Mambo sauce, but
Mm.
he quickly changed it to Mumbo within a year or two. And so, DC partisans will tell you that Mambo sauce is very different than Mumbo sauce. And my understanding is Mambo sauce is usually more for chicken and fries, although Mumbo sauce is all purpose. So I think this is like shades of gray, or shades of, I don't know, shades of red, I guess, if we're talking about barbecue sauce. So yeah, so it's an interesting subculture. And I've talked to people from Chicago and DC, and I got to tell you, I'm still not, I still think I have it twisted. So it just depends on who you talk to.
Yeah, it's interesting because I like to try different sauces wherever I am. And I mean, sauce is something I can bring back with me. The plate of barbecue, just quite frankly, isn't going to get much further than where I'm at the time. But and sauces, much like I like hot sauces too, Adrian, because again, there's such a variety out there. And I mean, I really challenge people, find that sauce that really works for you. Because boy, it can make all the difference in the world, and I love it. I think it's fun.
And for a
Um,
lot of barbecue people, the sauce is their calling card, more so than the meat.
yeah. So I don't know that when I get to the pearly gates, the people will be asking me what my favorite sauce was, but I can tell them what it is right now. But I won't. Secret. Um, so anyway, Adrian, let me turn it back to you, and let's keep on going with this fun story.
Yeah. So then the next chapter, I talk about competition barbecue because you don't see a lot of African Americans in competition barbecue. And so one thing that people may not know is this woman, Bessie Cathy, won the very first Memphis and May competition in the late 70s. And she showed up with a very minimal setup and won. So an African American woman won what has become the largest and probably the most well-known barbecue competition in the world. And I can't even imagine that happening today. But my theory is that you don't see a lot of African Americans on the barbecue circuit because of cost. The entry fees, the equipment. I mean, people pay $5,000, $10,000 for their barbecue rigs. And also you have to have a lifestyle where you can spend a lot of time on the road going to these various contests, because in order to win the big bucks, you usually have to qualify in several smaller contests. And, the typical worker has 2 weeks of vacation. And so, can you imagine talking to your honey and saying, hey, let's spend our vacation going to a barbecue contest? Now, you may have a soulmate like that who's down for that, but, there may be other venues that are desired, vacation sites. So, and we do know that when you have like barbecue contests where either the entry fee is very low or it's zero, you find African American presence pretty strong at those contests. Then I do a profile on a woman named Sylvie Curry. She's known as the Lady of Q. She's probably the most recognized African American woman on the competition circuit. She's done very well. And if you're a Netflix fan, she actually is on a show called America's Barbecue Showdown. I'm not going to give it away, but she has a very impressive run on the show. And I think you will be very pleased to see the pictures of the food that she makes on that show. And the remarkable thing about her is she does this all by herself. A lot of these competitors have several assistants, and she's not having that. She does it all herself. And so after doing writing about competition barbecue, then I just kind of go into this question about whether there's a barbecue aesthetic, an African-American barbecue aesthetic. So I'm just going to quickly go through highlights of regional styles. So we have the Carolinas.
Adrian, can I interrupt for 1 second though? Feel
Sure.
free to take some time. I know we haven't got any questions coming in, folks. I'd love for you to think back on maybe your barbecue experience. Maybe there's something that you want to share with the audience tonight, or even ask Adrian about. And I also challenge folks out there. Have you had something in the way of barbecue that just surprised you? That you couldn't believe they actually smoked something and ate it? And I know Adrian and I chatted about some of the different things that we've tried too. We'd love to hear what you have to say out there as well too. But Adrian, feel free to take the time to explain what you want to tell us about the regional styles of barbecue.
Sure. So we have the first slide is going to start with the Carolinas, because I believe Virginia, Carolinas, these are the earliest kind of barbecue cultures in our country. So Eastern North Carolina is going to be whole hog barbecue. That's purely an art form, chopped up and doused with the sauce. vinegar and red pepper flakes. And this sauce is actually applied throughout the cooking process. So it gives a real dimension of flavor to Carolina barbecue. Hush puppies are a side dish, coleslaw. And then when you get to the western part of the state, it's more pork shoulders. There's a little ketchup in the sauce. So it's the vinegar, red pepper, and some ketchup. And there are partisans on each side about this. And then in South Carolina, you've got more of a pork shoulder and a whole hog tradition. Various sauces. Sometimes you have mustard sauce. Sometimes you have the vinegar sauce and tomato-based sauce. So it's a real kind of amalgamation of different styles. But yeah, Carolinas are known for essentially pork barbecue. And then you've got what I call a deep South style. So that's going to be more pork shoulder, spare ribs, chicken. And then as side dishes, you're going to have, Southern food and soul food side. So collard greens. And I'm not sure when this happened, but mac and cheese now is a barbecue side dish. You're going to have white bread. You might have cornbread. And then in Georgia, you're going to have Brunswick stew as a side dish. And then I talked about Memphis. Memphis is a city with a style, and it's very eclectic. And so chopped pork sandwiches, usually with coleslaw on top. On the left-hand side, you've got a sandwich from Payne's Barbecue in Memphis. And to me, that's the platonic form of pork sandwiches. And then you've got a place like south side of Chicago, which should be known for its own regional style of rib tips, chicken, hot link sausages, fries, all doused in sauce. And then another place that doesn't get a lot of love is East Texas. When most people think Texas barbecue, they gravitate towards Central Texas. But East Texas has got it going on. A lot of the same basic ingredients, beef, pork, sausage, but often presented in a different way. So your brisket is probably going to be chopped up and mixed with some sauce or served with a lot of sauce. And so it's not the perfect manicured Instagrammable stuff that you see from Central Texas these days. And then Kansas City is a real melting pit. So beef, pork, and the beef will be brisket and also burnt ends, which we'll talk about in a second. It could be mutton, chicken, hot link sausages, sliced pork, chopped pork, all kinds of stuff going on in Kansas City. And another thing that I wanted to talk about when I talk about a barbecue aesthetic is, what are the things that are most likely to show up on a barbecue plate when you go to an African-American restaurant? So I think the big ones are pork spare ribs. And in African-American joints, the pork spare ribs tend to be less butchered than other places. So there's this thing called the St. Louis rack or the St. Louis cut. And essentially that's taking the very ovular spare ribs and cutting them in a way to make them look more rectangular in appearance. And so they're cutting off the rib tip, they're cutting off that flap on the back, and they're cutting off other things. And a lot of black joints, it's just less butchered. So you can get that rib tip, you might even get that flap on it. Pork shoulder, and that's going to be usually chopped up, and that could be served on a sandwich or separately. Another type of barbecue that you see a lot, or at least barbecue items, are going to be chicken. Chicken is very popular in a lot of joints, and it could be various pieces of barbecue chicken. And then I also think that another thing that's very popular in African-American joints are hot links. And if you're not familiar with hot links are a very coarsely ground, very spicy sausage. And sometimes they come in a very unnatural color of red, which tells you that food coloring has been added. But, chicken and sausage, hot link sausages are something I tend to see regardless of where I am in the country. And then there's some unusual things that show up. So rib tips, and supposedly rib tips were created in Southside Chicago. There was a guy named Leon Finney, a barbecue place called Leon's. And according to him, he was noticing that the stockyards, after they would create these St. Louis cuts, they were just throwing away the rib tips. So he waited until they closed and then just got those rib tips, cleaned them off, and started cooking them up. Of course, when the stockyards figured out what was going on, they started charging him. But that helped create that regional style. And now rib tips are everywhere. It's really become bar food. Another thing is Monroe County pork steak. So imagine taking a pork shoulder, freezing it, and then slicing it while frozen. And then when you are going to prepare it, you cook it and then it's like an inch to a half an inch thick, depending on taste. And then it's put on the grill for some char, and then it's doused in very spicy barbecue sauce. Another specialty that you see a lot, and this is in Memphis. Memphis is barbecue's funky town. There's a lot of interesting things happening there. But one is barbecue bologna. So imagine a tube of bologna with slits in it, put on a smoker, and then when your order is placed, they would cut off again like a half an inch, maybe up to an inch thick, but usually half an inch. And they put it on the grill for some char, and then it's white bread, bologna, sauce, coleslaw, more white bread. It's awesome. And then another thing that's glorious is barbecue spaghetti. So imagine instead of noodles with marinara sauce, you have noodles with barbecue sauce and grilled meat. It is definitely something to behold. And then the other thing we just have to take a moment to talk about is burnt ends. Now, there's this idea that burnt ends maybe were created in Texas or other places, but there's a clear origin story for burnt ends. It's this guy, Arthur Bryant, who we've already talked about. He ran a restaurant in Kansas City for years. And he, instead of throwing away the trimmings of brisket that he was, as he was preparing the orders for customers, he decided to save all those scraps, put them in a bowl and put them on the counter for his customers to munch on while they were waiting for their orders. So that's the origin of burnt ends. And so they were very crispy, shaved bits of briskets, not the manicured perfect cubes that we see today. That is a gentrification of burnt ends. But that's a little bit of the aesthetics of it. And so, I stop in. The reason why I do all of this, I go through the history, I talk about these people, and I talk about sauce and the aesthetics, is I wanted to ask this question. Why aren't African Americans getting any love in barbecue media? In fact, media is telling black barbecue people, we're just not that into you. And so I wanted to explore that. And to me, it's because barbecue media has fallen deeply, softly, tenderly, maddeningly in love with white dudes who barbecue. And there are really four types of white dudes who barbecue that have emerged, and it's four archetypes. So, this picture from Barbecue Pitmasters, which is the most influential barbecue show ever, no argument about that. You've got Tuffy Stone, decorated competition guy, world champion. You've got Myron Mixon in the middle. He's kind of a hybrid because he's well known in the competition circuit, but he kind of represents the Bubba type, right? The working class Southern white guy. And then you've got Aaron Franklin, I think the most recognizable barbecue man on the planet, who represents the urban hipsters, right? Interesting facial hair, tattoos, glasses, maybe some piercings, you know the type. And then you've got the fine dining chefs who are in barbecue in a way they never were before years ago. And I think Bobby Flay represents these folks. And I call them tokes who smoke. And why does this happen? Because of foodies. People like me, I'm one of them. The people who are intensely interested in food, looking for authentic experiences, got interested in barbecue and are asking two questions. What's barbecue? And where do I get the good stuff? And this all happens kind of in the late 80s, early 90s. So as there is a commensurate rise in media to cater to these group of foodies, when they were seeking experts to curate their experience, it's white dude after white dude after white dude was put forth as the experts, which leads us then to that Bon Appetit cover that I showed you earlier.
Adrian, how do you think all this can change? And what do you see happening now that shows more inclusivity with barbecue? Chocolate actually has evolved over 3,500 years. The people who make it, the way it's made, the people who consume it. Even today, there are changes being made in the way we actually enjoy chocolate. How do you think barbecue will change?
So I think there has to be just two sides to the equation. One, we have to have better storytelling from the media platforms that are focusing on barbecue. And then secondly, we as the consuming public, consuming this media, we have to ask for better. If an article comes out that doesn't have any African Americans, we got to tell people, hey, how come you don't have any African Americans in this article? Or you're missing this person or person. And you will see the media respond. So I think we just have to change the storytelling. And then we also have to support these African American barbecuers, go to their businesses, give them love on social media, and help amplify what they are doing. I think those are the key things.
Hey, can I interrupt you for 1 second, though, before we get on to this slide here, too? We got questions coming, and this is fantastic. Adrian, you want to field a few questions right now?
Sure.
So Sarah asks, any history behind spice use, and what are traditional spice mixtures?
Yeah, I haven't been able to figure that out because I'm just trying to figure out when did rubs really become a part of barbecue? And I haven't squared that circle yet. So it seems like it's more of a recent thing. But for a lot of time, for a couple centuries, barbecue seasoning was essentially that vinegar and red pepper mix. We do have accounts of indigenous people in the Caribbean using citrus juices and chilies to flavor meat. And so I think that the vinegar and red pepper was kind of like an ersatz version of that. And so in terms of just spicing that I see a lot, you see a lot of red pepper, you see a lot of brown sugar, and brown sugar gets kind of tricky because depending on where you have it over the fire, it could caramelize and scorch. But garlic, I see a lot of garlic. I see oregano sometimes. But I would say that like red pepper, garlic are kind of the chilies, and brown sugar. That sweet hot mix is kind of the stuff that I see most often. And then some things that we don't use anymore, like you look at the old recipes, you see a lot of MSG and commercial seasoning. I think we've gotten away from that. And then people are tight-lipped about their seasoning mixes.
Hey, I got another question. I can relate to this one too, because I've seen this too. From Susan, she asked, my daddy would mop his barbecue, a mop-looking brush. Do you use a mop? If not, what do you use? And when do you start basting the meat? She says, I was raised in Alabama.
Oh, great. Okay. So I don't use the mop, but my grandfather definitely did. But I use a spray bottle. And so I usually have a mixture of apple cider and some other secret things that I'm not going to tell you. And so I usually do it like I usually cook spare ribs. And so I'm usually start basting it in the third and fourth hours, just lightly as it's cooking. So I wanted to get that smoke the first couple of hours, and then I start adding that later. So I use a spray bottle. I do not use a syringe. I'm not at that point yet because that's what you see on the competition circuit.
Thank you. And here's another one too. So what do you think of the barbecue competitions? Are there certified competitions, Adrian?
Oh, yes. And I'm actually a certified barbecue judge. So what you all should understand is that there are several sanctioning bodies in barbecue. It's much like boxing. And so one day I hope to have an elastic belt for each sanctioning body. But I'm in the Kansas City Barbecue Society. And yeah, so there's a lot of sanctioned events, and competition barbecue has exploded. When I became a judge in 2004, there were only like a few thousand judges. Now they're, close to 100,000, maybe even more. And so for a lot of these contests, unless you are at your computer when they announce openings, you're just on a wait list forever. So I actually don't get to judge a lot of competitive barbecue anymore. So I get asked to do celebrity judging. But yeah, I got to tell you, it's the most interesting conversation starter I've ever had. People are like, oh, you worked in the White House? Okay, that's cool. But you're a barbecue judge? I want to talk to you about that.
Adrian, I can relate to that a little bit too, because people think I've got a pretty cool job. And I agree. I got a really cool job too. Telling the story of chocolate, it's all right.
Yeah.
Adrian, this is all incredibly fascinating history. What do you see also as the future of barbecue, but from an African-American perspective?
So I'm really excited about the future of barbecue, but if we could look at the next slide, let's just talk about the conventional wisdom that's emerged and then use that as a counterpoint to African-American barbecue. So there's the idea that this is legit barbecue, like the best barbecue is low and slow. So that's indirect cooking, right? Low temperature for a long period of time. But a lot of African-Americans cook directly over the heat source and cook hot, fast, then slow. So the low and slow, that's one type of barbecue, but not the whole story. Using the lesser cuts of meat, of course, that's, the brisket, the spare ribs, all of that stuff. But those traditions are only about 100 years old. And I'm relying on the research and argument of Robert Moss, who's the Southern Living magazine barbecue editor. He's the one that makes the argument that the transition from whole animal cooking in a rural context to using lesser cuts of meat in an urban context is what gives rise to a lot of the regional styles that we talk about today. And then the minimal seasoning, just salt and pepper. And I'm sorry, I forgot, I should have mentioned that. That's a lot of barbecue rubs. That's a chef's sensibility, right? Minimal seasoning, taste the meat. But as we know, a lot of people are heavily invested and very creative with the rubs that they've come up with. And then we've already talked about this sauce, the idea that legit barbecue has no sauce. So I'm very excited about the future of barbecue because of people like Rodney Scott. He's a whole hog barbecue guy out of South Carolina. He's got restaurants in Charleston, Birmingham, and I believe his restaurant is now open in Atlanta. If you haven't had his barbecue, please go check it out. And he's like a possible future for barbecue because he has got the vision. He's got some financial backing. And I think he's going to spread the gospel of whole hog barbecue. And the other cool thing is he just came out with a cookbook called Rodney Scott's World of Barbecue. And dig this, Dave. He's the first African-American pitmaster to get a cookbook published by a major publisher in 3 decades. So now think about all the books that come out every year. That's just crazy.
That's fantastic. That's great news, though. I mean, that points to the direction of the future of African American barbecue.
Yep. Another person I'm excited about, 2 people are Ryan and Ed Mitchell. Ed Mitchell is a barbecue legend in North Carolina. His son Ryan is very interested now in the business, and so we see an intergenerational team, which is always just heartwarming to see. And they're doing whole hog barbecue. And the scene on the right is from the New York City's Big Apple barbecue block party, which they used to have about a decade ago, but it got so big that they just don't do it anymore. And so they are primed and ready to go. And COVID slowed down their restaurant opening. They were supposed to open a restaurant last year, but I think they're on target to open a restaurant this summer, and it may have already happened. I didn't get a chance to look before we had this presentation. Next slide. And then I love talking about African-American women in barbecue. Deborah and Mary Jones of Jones Barbecue. If you saw Queer Eye, you probably saw them featured. Their business has skyrocketed since being featured on that show. And lovely women making great barbecue, and they're so fun to hang out with, man. They're just cool people. But one thing I love about them is they have created, next slide, a barbecue vending machine. So 24/7, you can get hooked up on sauce, sandwiches, entrees, whatever. And I just think that's brilliant. Next slide.
You know where they need one of those, Adrian, is in an airport.
Yes, absolutely. You know, there's not a homegrown barbecue vendor at the Kansas City airport. Can you believe that? That's really, yeah, they could definitely set that up there.
There's an opportunity.
Yep. And then I'm just looking at barbecue trends. So one barbecue trend is turkey. And so these are turkey ribs. Oh, if we could go back and play the video, this is opening up. Yes, there we go. So these are turkey ribs, and this is a specialty out of St. Louis. And so a turkey rib is taking a turkey's shoulder blade and butchering the meat in a way that it looks like a spare rib like that. You're seeing that in a lot of places. In the Carolinas, you're seeing turkey take the place of pork. And I'm just got to tell you, except for a difference in color, it tastes a lot like pork. And then in Southside Chicago, instead of the pork rib tips and pork sausages, I'm seeing turkey hot links. I'm seeing turkey tips, all kinds of things. And I think this is parallels what happened in soul food a couple of decades ago with consumers wanting healthier options. Next slide. And then another trend that's really interesting is plant-based barbecue. And jackfruit is one that's really popular right now as an option, as a meat substitute or another option. And I got to tell you, Dave, this is going to sound weird, but for somebody who knows what they're doing, they can make jackfruit look, taste, and have the texture of pork. And I've tasted this myself. I was highly skeptical, and I tasted it myself, and it does work.
Are there any other vegan type of offerings that you've come across?
Yeah, so in some places, people are experimenting with different roots, like lotus root and burdock, and they're cutting them in a way to make them look like rib tips. And then they're cooking them and trying to get them to have the texture of rib tips and then putting them in sauce. But there are some companies that have developed plant-based burnt ends and some other things. So I've only heard about these things. I'm waiting to taste them. And actually this weekend, I'm going to San Francisco, Bay Area. And in Oakland, there is a vegan barbecue restaurant called Vegan Mob. And he has plant-based burnt ends. So I'll have to circle back to you.
I hope so, please. Don't hesitate to send those too, by the way.
I don't know if they're going to make it into the luggage, man. I might be grubbing on them. And then, I just muse about the future of barbecue. So the technology is here. We can have lab grown meat and we can have 3D printed meat. So the question is, will consumers accept this? I'm not so sure. But if we get over the kind of factor, that could have a transformative effect on the way our agricultural system exists now when it comes to meat and also in terms of animal welfare. So will people be grubbing on Impossible ribs in 10 years? I don't know, but it's a possibility. Next slide. So I started this book thinking that I might be writing an elegy for African-American barbecue, but now I'm excited. I see a future where the barbecue scene has shifted from maybe brick and mortar locations, not many restaurants as we had in the past, but we've got people on the roadside doing their thing in parking lots, family gatherings, churches. So the tradition is vibrant and strong.
I would be remiss if I didn't say, Adrian, as a chocolate historian, I must mention my favorite way to end a meal. And Adrian, the perfect the perfect way I think to end a glorious barbecue meal is with some delicious American Heritage chocolate. And for those of you who aren't familiar with American Heritage chocolate, it's actually chocolate based upon recipes from the 1750s. It's chocolate made with different seasonings, things like cinnamon, nutmeg, anise, a little bit of sugar, vanilla, and red pepper. And it's just a really nice, unique flavor. If you haven't tried it, you can go online, Amazon.com, or maybe some of your favorite historic sites and museums as you travel around. Get some American Heritage chocolate. I think you'll enjoy it too. And Claire, before we get to Q&A, I think you have an announcement. Am I correct, Claire?
Yes, that's correct. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to be really quick, but we have 3 winners of a free copy of Adrian's book. So if you are really excited about it and your name is either Elon Osby, Viviana Dickinson, and Paulette Bolton, y'all are winners this evening. I will follow up with you via email after the event tonight to get your information, to mail you your copy of the book. So thank you to everyone who joined us tonight and to our 3 winners. Congratulations, Elon, Viviana, and Paulette. I will be following up with you. And now I'm really excited to get to our audience questions because there are a lot of them.
Yes, we got people chatting now, Claire. So let's get to it. So again, congratulations to our winners, and I hope you enjoy the book as much as I've enjoyed it. Question came in to Adrian. Kelly says, I live in Knoxville and Tennessee, and we get a nice mix of Carolina and Memphis barbecue. Do you have any recommendations on Black-owned joints in East Tennessee?
I don't, unfortunately. I have been to Knoxville and stuff, but I just can't remember a place that comes to mind for barbecue. So I don't have an answer for you, unfortunately.
Let's try another one too. Let's see. I signed on a little late, Tanya says, but if it has not been discussed, how important is what type of cooking elements used, such as coal or wood?
So I think for African American barbecue, charcoal is a huge part of the tradition. In fact, I think that if you go to a black barbecue joint, unless you're in particular regions, I think people are expecting some kind of charcoal, flavor to their barbecue. So I think it's huge. So a mixture of charcoal, and then when I cook, I do a mixture of charcoal briquettes and hickory wood because I just love the perfume of hickory and things like that. But I think charcoal is elemental to African American barbecue in most places.
Excellent. Hey, Adrian, what's your favorite fire, gas or charcoal? And we always hear about Southern barbecue. Fred asked, is there a Northern barbecue? Is there such a thing?
Yeah, there actually is a Northern barbecue. And at least in African American circles, when I was in, and Northern, I'm just talking about outside the South. Let me just put it that way. So yeah, just kind of to what I said in the previous question, most of the Northern joints I went to, it was definitely barbecue cooked over charcoal. There may be a little wood added, but it was really just kind of that charcoal taste. And really spare ribs, a lot of fries, and a lot of sauce. And I would say that those are, and the interesting thing about a lot of these joints outside the South is there is a rib geography. So you can actually pick what part of the spare ribs your ribs are coming from, center, small end, or the big end. So it was kind of cool.
Wonderful.
But yeah, in terms of fire for me, I'm a charcoal and wood mix guy.
Someone else asked a question about New York City barbecue. Any recommendations on New York City barbecue?
Yeah, I couldn't find a black-owned joint in New York City that I loved, and I've been asking around, and I haven't heard anything. So a couple of places I did like. There was a place called Home Team Barbecue in Brooklyn. There's also a place called Izzy's, which is kosher barbecue in the Crowns Heights neighborhood. I also like Main House Barbecue, which is also kosher. And then there's another place called Fet Sal in Hill Country. Those are the kind of places. Those are the places I remember from New York City.
Wonderful. Good. Well, hopefully I get a chance to get into the city and give those a try, or at least one of them. Hey, another question came in here. Eartha asked, is there diversification in the judging of barbecue? And if not, what can be done about it?
No, unfortunately, there's not. So when I was judging contests, there were very few African Americans or even just people of color in it. And I think that's just because of the perception of barbecue. I don't think it's anything about the organizers excluding people. So I think it's going to be up to people like me and others to say, hey, I had a great time judging and you should give it a try. Because it's, you have to, the commitment is just a few hours to go learn how to be a judge. And then it's up to you how much time you put into it. So, yeah, I haven't seen a lot of people of color interested in being judges, or nor competing. So I think, we've got this problem where we just got to tell people it's fun, and it's a great experience, and we need to see more of us in these settings.
Well, hey, can you share a little bit about your own story though, too, Adrian? I mean, how did you become a barbecue judge, and is becoming a barbecue judge kind of similar to being a sommelier? I mean, is it how do you qualify for that?
Yeah, well, we don't spit out our food, but basically, I went to a setting, and when I walked in the room, there were about 70 people there, and I was the only dude under 250. So I just realized what my future was going to be like in terms of my weight. But I was fine with that. And so, really, these contests just show you the process. So the categories in the Kansas City Barbecue Society would be pork, just pork shoulder, beef, usually brisket, pork spare ribs, and chicken, usually thighs. And then you judge it on taste, texture, and appearance, 9-point scale. And then they give all these sanctioning bodies have arbitrary rules. So in the Kansas City Barbecue Society, one of the arbitrary rules is you can only serve your barbecue on green leaf lettuce, flat leaf parsley, or cilantro. So if you made the best barbecue in the world and served it on collard greens, disqualified. So they bring out food so you get the hang of it. They bring out something illegal just to see if you catch it. And if you don't, they would say, Adrian, you should have noticed this. And after that, you stand up, you take a barbecue oath. It's a sacred thing, which I'm not going to repeat because I can already tell that people on this webinar would mock it. And then you get your badge in the mail a few weeks later. And once you have your badge, you can go to any sanctioned contest. But now, because judging is so popular, you have to actually sign up electronically ahead of time for most contests.
Thank you for that. Interested to see your badge. Could you speak more about, sorry, Willie asked, could you speak more about barbecue gentrification as folks get transitioned out of neighborhoods? Do you see more pop-up food trucks, et cetera?
Yeah, that's what I kind of meant by barbecue scene shifting. We're just finding more people doing food trucks and pop-up experiences because they're getting squeezed out of the brick and mortar places because the rents are high. And a lot of times barbecue joints get closed down because neighbors start complaining about air pollution and because of all the smoke. And yeah, so it's a real problem. And, we're just seeing Black entrepreneurs adjust. And then the other thing is now that barbecue is so popular and we have fine dining chefs saying you have to use the highest quality meat and things like that, there's a skyrocketing price increase in barbecue as well. Like brisket, people are paying $30 a pound for brisket. I mean, 50 years ago, you wouldn't even, come close to paying that much. Spare ribs, chicken, $24 for a whole chicken. Yeah, so that kind of thing. So it's a real challenge in barbecue circles. And so I think of barbecue as a glorious food, but I think of it as a working class food that's affordable. And so we now have a splintering of the barbecue world. And John Shelton Reed, another barbecue guy, writes about this very eloquently. But we've got mass barbecue, craft barbecue, all these different variations of barbecue that have emerged.
Well, we could keep going on and on, but I've got one more question and then we're going to have to wrap up. Sorry about that for everybody who asked questions and I didn't get a chance to get to them. But an interesting question. I think this is pretty good. I like this one. Stan asked the question, looks like the original barbecue was over direct heat. When did the smoking of meat over indirect heat begin? What caused the change? And I'm going to add to this one too. What's next in barbecue preparation?
Yeah, so the indirect smoking really is the advent of Central European immigrants who brought that tradition with them from Europe. And so this takes root in Texas, especially Central Texas. And those immigrants really start showing up in the latter part of the 19th century. So it's really around then that we start hearing about these meat markets that have been started where barbecue is prepared. And usually they were just selling the stuff or cooking the stuff they couldn't sell in the meat market. And so the tradition began. So it's really kind of these Central European immigrants that start that tradition. And so it's about roughly a little more than 100 years old when we have centuries old cooking over direct heat whole animals. What's next for barbecue in terms of the cooking practice? I think it's just wide open. This is a period of innovation. And so, there are going to be people that are quibbling about the way that barbecue is being redefined and other things. And I think that's kind of the fun of it, is just trying to figure out how these things play out. But, my feeling is there's room in the cookout for everybody. And so we can have fun arguing about these things, but hopefully the barbecue brings us together.
I love that. The one thing, Adrian, I would love to be able to do sometime with you is try to find some of the most unique meats that are prepared, or maybe even vegetables, right? So I'm happy to give that a try too. So I think we learned a lot tonight. I think you shared a lot of fascinating new information. I mean, if some of this is new to you, again, I encourage you to learn more about what the research that Adrian has done. I think you'll get a big kick out of some of the different things he's done. Open your eyes to this amazing world of not only barbecue, but the role African Americans have really played in launching this. So I want to say thank you all the people who joined us this evening for a fantastic evening, and a special thank you to my friend Adrian. Have a great evening, Adrian, and everybody else.
Thank you so much.